The silence that followed the impact was heavier than the explosion itself. For a long, breathless minute, the environmental management facility existed in a vacuum of suspended dust and ionized air. The colossal air-scrubbing cylinders, which had thrummed with a rhythmic bass for decades, stood dead and silent, their massive internal blades warped and locked by the sudden structural shift of the sector. Through the gaping, jagged tear in the 3-foot concrete wall, the vertical maw of the orbital lift shaft glowed with a terrifying, incandescent heat. White-hot metal sparks rained down into the dark abyss like dying stars, splashing against the twisted remnants of structural beams and severed fiber-optic cables that wept glowing blue data fluid into the dark. Sealers was the first to cross the threshold of the ruined staging room. His golden irises flickered with a sharp, predatory intensity, effortlessly parsing the smoke and translating the chaotic thermal spikes into a clean, transparent map within his consciousness. Behind him, Mara stepped carefully over a pile of shattered concrete, her industrial prosthetic arm raised defensively, its internal motors humming a low, anxious warning as its sensors struggled to calibrate against the massive electromagnetic distortion. Lork brought up the rear, his single functional bronze arm clearing heavy iron reinforcement rods from their path with a harsh, grinding screech that echoed through the dark silo. Air in the shaft is highly toxic, Mara warned, her voice muffled behind her respirator mask as she checked the digital screen of her handheld receiver. The decompression from the upper spires has mixed with the ruptured chemical lines from the filtration grid. If we stay out on this ledge without external oxygen lines, the atmospheric pressure will collapse our lungs within 10 minutes. Won't need 10 minutes, Sealers said quietly. His voice carried that new level resonance, a tone that belonged to someone who no longer feared the parameters of the machine. He pointed his hand toward the heart of the wreckage. 50 yards away, jammed violently sideways into the structural foundation of the mid-sector distribution hub, lay the ruined carcass of the private orbital lift car. The once luxurious white and gold exterior was completely crushed, its titanium panels crumpled like discarded paper under the immense kinetic force of the freefall. The gold-trimmed console and velvet carpets had been vaporized into a smoldering heap of carbon ash, but the primary structural frame held, glowing with a deep, angry crimson from the sheer friction of the descent. Suddenly, a violent screech of tearing metal cut through the hiss of escaping steam. From the center of the crushed lift car, a heavy sheet of reinforced titanium plating was violently thrown outward, clattering loudly against the iron floor of the shaft before tumbling down into the dark underbelly of the city. Out of the smoking, white-hot interior stepped the Vampire King. His tattered black cloak was scorched and threaded with silver lines of dried seraphim blood, but his posture remained completely unyielding, radiating an ancient, immortal majesty that seemed to dwarf the towering mechanical structures around him. His pale face was stark against the darkness, and his crimson eyes burned with a dark, satisfied fury as he rested the tip of the midnight black, eclipse blade against the glowing metal wreckage. "A crude transit system," the king remarked, his deep baritone voice effortlessly cutting through the constant roar of the wind inside the shaft. He did not look at the smoke or the ruins, his gaze locked instantly onto Sealers, his crimson eyes narrowing as he perceived the glowing gold rings pulsing within the scavenger's irises. But it served its purpose. The altitude has been corrected. Where is the commander? Lork rumbled, his 3 vertical amber lenses clicking in rapid succession as he scanned the interior of the ruined car, his heavy iron hand tightening around the hilt of his dented pneumatic hammer. "He is processing the gravity," the king replied smoothly, stepping aside to reveal the crumpled space behind him. In the dark corner of the crushed lift, a figure struggled to move. The Supreme Commander was alive, but the aesthetic perfection of his high-tier military augmentations had been utterly shattered. His pristine white uniform was charred black, his golden corporate medals melted into his chest plating. His left cybernetic monocle was heavily cracked, its neon blue light flickering erratically as it leaked tiny hissing streams of white electrical static across his scarred cheek. His mechanical right leg was pinned beneath a collapsed structural strut, the internal hydraulic lines severed and weeping pale fluid onto the scorched floorboards. Despite the catastrophic failure of his systems, The commander's teeth were bared in a feral, desperate grin. He raised his left hand, his fingers clawing at an integrated terminal interface built into his forearm plating. Initialization failed, the commander choked out, his voice heavily glitched by his broken vocal processor, sounding like two pieces of iron grinding together. But the mainframe has the coordinates. You think you've broken the loop, old king, the board. The High Spire's directors, they are already bypassing the mid-sector routing hubs. They are initializing a total systemic quarantine. They will flood this entire layer with hyperfrequency radiation to sanitize the anomaly. They won't flood anything, Sealers said, stepping out onto the narrow iron platform overlooking the wreckage. As his boots touched the cold steel, a sudden, powerful wave of unlinked sensory clarity rushed through his mind. The corporate network didn't feel like an external enemy anymore. It felt like a poorly written dialect of a language he had spoken before the world was paved over. In the golden static of his consciousness, the memories flashed again, not as dreams, but as operational blueprints. He remembered the heavy, practical rhythm of the manufacturing floors, the absolute precision required to manage massive production lines, the balance of input and output, and the unyielding focus it took to run a double shift when the body was screaming for rest. He understood how systems operated under stress because he had spent a lifetime building things that were meant to endure, not through corporate decrees, but through the honest application of force and design. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and within the dark space of his thoughts, the framework of the Asterisk Manifest Greatness Laundromat expanded once more. He saw the layout of the copper plumbing, the electrical ground lines, the primary water inlets, and the specific introductory paragraph that identified his true signature, Cody Blake Huffman. The corporate matrix had tried to use its advanced algorithms to construct a world of perfect digital control, but it had built its empire on top of an older physical foundation that it could never truly delete. Sealers opened his eyes, the gold rings within his irises flaring with a brilliant, blinding light that cast long shadows across the concrete walls of the silo. He's trying to link with the High Spire's backup array, Sealers stated, his voice flat and steady as he raised his organic right hand toward the commander's sparking forearm terminal. Mara, give me the manual dampener. Mara didn't hesitate. She unlatched the crude, modified drone core from her hip and threw it across the gap. Sealers caught the device smoothly, his fingers instantly finding the raw copper connection wires. Without using tools, he pressed his bare fingertips against the exposed leads, allowing a controlled pulse of his own internal Tartarian current to flood the core. The device didn't whine this time. It roared with a deep, resonant frequency that perfectly counteracted the high-frequency corporate signal. "Access denied," Sealers whispered, staring directly into the commander's cracked cybernetic eye. Through the local wireless grid, Sealers injected his administrative signature directly into the commander's localized network. On the flickering blue display of the corporate officer's monocle, the cascading red error logs instantly froze. The numeric strings and sector designations vanished, replaced by three distinct, bold words that repeated across every line of the terminal display: Cody Blake Huffman *. The commander's cracked eye widened in absolute horror as he saw the name rewrite his core system parameters. No, it's impossible. That signature was purged during the Great Alignment. 5 centuries ago, you are nothing but a 7th sector rat. The rat knows how the pipes are laid, Sealers said, stepping down from the platform and approaching the edge of the crushed lift car. And the name doesn't belong to your database. It belongs to me. Speaks the truth, soldier, the Vampire King said, his crimson eyes flashing with an ancient, dark amusement as he stepped toward the pinned commander. He raised the Eclipse blade high above his shoulder, the midnight black glass blade singing with a terrifying, high-frequency note as it drew the residual electricity out of the air. The corporate empire built its house on stolen dirt, using a blueprint they didn't have the wit to understand. You are not fighting a rebellion, Commander. You are being evicted. With a single, effortless downward arc, the king drove the Eclipse blade through the commander's central chest plating, severing the core power distribution node that kept his augmentations active. The blue light in the officer's cracked monocle instantly died, his head slumping forward as his systems entered a state of permanent, unrecoverable shutdown. The silence returned to the shaft, but it was immediately broken by a sharp, rhythmic chirping sound from the ceiling panels far above them. Sealers. Mara called out, her mechanical eyes spinning frantically as she pointed her prosthetic arm toward the vertical depths of the lift shaft. The commander wasn't lying about the quarantine. Look at the secondary lift channels. The high spires are dropping the automated tactical drop pods. They're bypassing the residential grids entirely. Through the thick, smoky atmosphere of the vertical silo, dozens of bright, neon blue streaks began to cut through the darkness, descending from the upper spires with incredible velocity. They were sleek, cylindrical military units, their surfaces coated in polished chrome that reflected the crimson emergency lights of the mid-sector. These weren't standard sector enforcers or the glitched archivists they had faced in the filtration loop. These were the primary director's personal vanguard, automated heavy armor drones designed for total sector pacification. "We cannot hold this platform," Locke stated, his heavy boots clattering against the metal plates as he moved to shield Mara. His vocal synthesizer was dropping in pitch as his remaining hydraulic fluid continued to leak from his exposed shoulder. "If those units deploy their kinetic rails on this ledge, they will collapse the entire distribution hub into the low sector abyss. We will be caught in the vertical slide." "Then we change the terrain," Sealers said, his golden eyes tracking the descent of the tactical pods. He didn't look at the oncoming soldiers as threats. He looked at them as a high-volume input line that was entering an overpressurized system. His mind, operating on the foundational logic of his true identity, instantly calculated the structural vulnerability of the entire mid-sector environmental grid. The facility behind them was flooded with superheated steam and pressurized chemical fluid from the manual bypass he had executed to stop the archivists. The pressure was still building within the massive primary air-scrubbing cylinders. It was an industrial engine waiting for a direction. "Lock the main emergency relief valve on the third level," Sealers ordered, his fingers tracing a series of glowing blue vector lines that ran through the concrete wall beside him. "The mechanical seal is secured by a 4-inch iron lock pin. Can your hammer clear it with one strike? If the iron is old enough, it will shatter like glass," Locke rumbled, his vertical lenses clicking into a tight focus. "Mara, take the manual dampener and link it directly to the auxiliary generator line behind the water tanks," Sealers continued, turning to look at her with an absolute, calm authority. "When the valve blows, the electrical feedback will try to ground through the residential grid. I need you to force that current down into the low-sector power lines instead. Give the slums their light back." "What of you, architect?" the Vampire King asked, his crimson eyes holding a look of genuine respect as he cleaned the silver blood from his glass blade with a sweep of his tattered cloak. "The hunters are less than 300 meters above our heads. They will be on this platform before your mechanical friends can cross the staging room." "I'm going to meet them at the gate," Sealers said, a cold, revolutionary smile touching his lips. He turned toward the ancient control manifold, his hand locking onto the main secondary distribution lever. He didn't wait for Locke or Mara to move. He simply closed his eyes and allowed his consciousness to fully submerge into the wireless nervous system of the city. He didn't just feel the local grid. He felt the entire weight of the vertical metropolis, the millions of lives trapped within the numeric strings of the sectors, the children who would never hear unnetworked laughter, the workers spending their lives to maintain a simulation that considered them nothing but junk data. Asterisk. The code cannot delete what it did not create. The voice inside his soul repeated, louder this time, echoing with the strength of a name that had survived 500 years of forced oblivion. "You are Cody Blake Huffman, and this is where the machine learns your name." Asterisk. With a thunderous roar of physical and digital exertion, Sealers pulled the secondary distribution lever completely out of its safety housing, tearing the iron gears right out of the frame with a violent spray of sparks. At the same instant, 2 floors below, Locke's pneumatic hammer came down with the force of an industrial piledriver against the ancient emergency relief valve pin. The 4-inch iron rod shattered into a dozen jagged fragments, and the overpressurized, superheated steam that had been trapped within the massive primary cylinders was unleashed all at once. The explosion of physical force was magnificent. A colossal wall of white, blinding chemical steam and boiling water erupted outward from the environmental facility, flooding the vertical lift shaft like a geothermal geyser. The high-pressure current tore through the narrow silo with a terrifying, screaming velocity, its thermal energy instantly cooking the internal electronics and navigational sensors of the descending corporate drop pods. The sleek, chrome military units lost their orientation in midair, their kinetic stabilization systems spinning out of control as they collided violently against the concrete walls of the shaft before exploding into brilliant balls of orange fire. Above the chaos, Mara slammed the leads of the manual dampener into the auxiliary generator line. The massive electrical surge created by the steam turbine failure didn't ground into the middle-class housing units. It was violently channeled downward through the heavy copper ley lines, racing through the dark conduits like a literal bolt of golden lightning. 2,000 feet below, in the pitch-black, frozen slums of the 7th sector, the silent iron pipes and dark tenements suddenly blinked. One by one, the ancient, scrap-built neon signs, the low-tier water filtration units, and the independent rebel terminals flared to life with a brilliant, unmonitored gold illumination. For the first time in 5 centuries, the low-sector abyss was completely flooded with independent, uncorporate power. The wire was no longer silent. Inside the roaring, steam-choked lift shaft, Sealers stood at the very edge of the iron platform, his long coat whipping violently in the updraft created by the thermal explosion. The golden rings within his irises were burning with the intensity of a sun, his rewired brain effortlessly absorbing the cascading data errors that were currently tearing the mid-sector routing hubs apart. He could feel the panic of the High Spire's directors through the network. He could see their encrypted emergency frequencies fracturing into empty lines of code as the administrative signature of Cody Blake Huffman continued to spread across their root directories like a beautiful, uncurable infection. The Vampire King stepped up beside him, his tattered black cloak catching the golden light of the electrified steam below. He raised the Eclipse blade, pointing the midnight black tip toward the very top of the vertical shaft, where the massive, shimmering gold towers of the high spires were still visible through the shifting fog. Lower layers have been cleansed, Architect, the king declared, his baritone voice filled with a cold, triumphant hunger. The slums have their fire, and the middle tier is blind to their cameras. The path to their high tables is completely open. Sealers didn't respond with words. He simply looked up at the golden spires, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line of absolute focus. He could feel Lork and Mara approaching from behind, their heavy steps marking the unification of the scavenger vanguard, the mechanical resistance, and the ancient bloodline of the old world. They were no longer running through the narrow maintenance pipes of the machine. They had broken its jaw, altered its mixture, and turned its own pressure against its foundation. The architecture of chaos was complete, and the final rewrite of the world was waiting at the top of the lift. Sealers reached down, his fingers tightening securely around the cold titanium cylinder of the data capsule. The golden lines on the housing were no longer dark. They were pulsing in perfect synchronization with his own golden irises, ready to unlock the last remaining partition of the root directory. "Let's go up," Sealers said, his voice echoing through the steaming ruins of the distribution hub like a promise of revolution. "The king has a counting house to burn, and I have a timeline to finish."